And welcome to the Shipping Professional Networks event number 95, Change Management 2.0. This is a post-COVID follow-up to last year's in-person event number 89, Change and Disruption Management, hosted by Wikborg Rein. I will now introduce you to Baptiste Wikborg, who is a partner at Wikborg Rein and will chair this panel. Baptiste, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Maria. I'm delighted to be chairing this latest joint event between Wikborg Rein and the SPNL. As Maria mentioned, this is the second joint event on change management, and some of you may have attended the previous event at our office back in March 2019. Back then, we looked at how to negotiate and develop contract terms to manage change. This year, we'll be focusing on some of the lessons and challenges faced over the past 12 months, both from a contentious and non-contentious point of view. We have three excellent speakers today. The first speaker is Alex Hookway, a senior lawyer at Wikborg Rein's Shipping and Offshore Group here in London. Alex has a broad range of contentious experience, both wet and dry. Alex will be starting off by looking at the scale of changes over the past 12 months and how those have affected multiple contract clauses, liability regimes, and operations. Our second speaker is Monica Coley, a senior lawyer in Guard's London office. Monica brings with her a wealth of experience, being dual qualified in India and in England and Wales, and having practiced shipping and trade law for the past 2 decades. Monica is also a co-chairman of WISTA, and chair of the Indian Maritime Association in the UK. Monica will be following up and touching on some of the issues mentioned by Alex in his presentation, and providing us with an insight from a P&I perspective over the past 12 months. Our third and final speaker will be Nikhil Datta, a senior associate in Wikborg Rein's Shipping and Offshore Group here in London. While Nikhil has a broad range of contentious experience from his time working for P&I clubs, owners and charters, he also specializes in all aspects of shipping and offshore energy projects, including construction, financing, and sale and purchase. Nikhil will be wearing his non-contentious hat today, so we will be swinging over to the transactional world for our final presentation, and looking in particular at how the market has been preparing for the discontinuance of Libor at the end of this year. As most of you will be aware, Libor is the market's most common method of setting interest rates. So this change will have broad implications for loan agreements, bond agreements, leasing agreements, derivative products, and many more transactions, as Nikhil will explain during his presentation. So enough from me. Let's move on to our first speaker, Alex Hookway.
Thanks, Baptiste. Good afternoon. As Baptiste mentioned, I'm a senior lawyer here at WR, and I'm going to talk to you today about some of the issues and trends that we've learned for the past year, with a particular focus on contract advisory, dispute resolution, and lessons learned. So, new slide, please, Mina. So a brief overview with the content of this presentation, just starting with a recap of last year's change management event, which took place just a few weeks before the national lockdown in February 2020. I'll then turn to cover 4 particular issues which we've routinely advised upon during the course of 2020 and continue to do so to this day. That's force majeure, frustration, floating storage, crew changes, and notice requirements. And then to finish, I'll round up with a brief reflection of what's changed in dispute resolution over the past year and what the future of dispute resolution might look like going forward. So, new slide, please. So 2020, well, what a year. In the middle of these images, which capture just some of the impacts of the global pandemic, you'll see an SPNL Facebook post reporting on an event held in February 2020. Not a mask in sight, no social distancing. I think there might have been some hand sanitizer, but I think a laugh was actually generated when that was announced. So the world has certainly changed. But at that webinar, my colleagues and guest speakers explored how to manage change in contracts. And so with the benefit of hindsight, well, how did they do? Well, with all the relevant considerations and key issues were identified and developed by our speakers, I think our speakers can be fully forgiven for not appreciating quite how much change came about during the course of 2020. And this change affected and triggered not just single clauses in single areas, but multiple clauses in long-standing maritime and commercial contracts in ways that potentially had never even been considered before. So let's have a look at some of these trends that we faced last year. New slide, please, thanks. So force majeure and frustration. Well, for me, these are the headline issues of 2020. I think it's fair to say that UK lawyers have probably never given force majeure provisions and frustration case law quite so much consideration as we did between March and June 2020. But do you know the difference after all that has passed? Well, to start with, there's no freestanding concept of force majeure under English law. Force majeure is a creature of contract, and as such, the terms can vary quite significantly between contracts and sectors, and even between the same counterparties for the same products or services under different contracts. A force majeure clause typically excuses one or more parties from performance of the contract in some way following the occurrence of certain events. Its underlying principle is that the occurrence of certain events which are outside of a party's control, that a party should be excused from or entitled to suspend performance for all or part of its obligations. That party will not be liable for failure to perform the obligations in accordance with the terms of that clause. So if you have your force majeure clause, you need to get to know it, know what the triggers are, any qualifications which might apply, what notices do you need to invoke the clause, and what is the impact of successfully invoking the clause? Is it a wholesale cancellation? Is it excusing non-performance for whole or part? Or perhaps it entitles a party to a time extension. However, if you don't have a force majeure clause, or perhaps the event doesn't fall within the scope of your FM clause, you may well be in frustration territory. Unlike force majeure, frustration is a freestanding common law concept, which provides that a contract becomes difficult or even impossible to perform as a result of a supervening event outside the control of the parties. It can be brought to an end and the parties are excused from their future obligations, and at common law, losses lie where they fall. However, where an alleged frustrating event should have been foreseen by the parties, or if there is a contractual remedy, frustration will not be an option. And I think the important takeaway from this final point is that for contracts entered into from around February 2020 and beyond, the foreseeability element of COVID really came to the fore, and it would become increasingly difficult to invoke frustration. So we talk about 2020 being a year of extreme change. We now turn to a scenario which no one had probably previously predicted. New slide, please. Floating storage. So here we have a table here showing the unthinkable, negative oil prices. So in April 2020, WTI crude dipped down to about minus 35 at its worst, due to continued high production, significantly reduced demand, and a lack of onshore storage. This led to parties using floating storage to plug the gap and wait for the market to recover. And as VLCC and ULCC rates spiraled around this time, what might have been a modest off-hire, demurrage, or damages claims instantly became a whole series of high-value claims around the world. So what's the position under the different charters? Well, it depends on the terms of your specific charters, but generally, for a time charter, charterers are free to carry the cargo as they see fit within the charter period. Where there is a specific charter clause permitting floating storage, then charterers have that option. But in the absence of an express clause, there is a potential debate as to whether the charterer's order to store is lawful. This will depend on the consideration of the relevant charter terms and whether an owner has issued a bill of lading, because you'd need cargo owners' permission, and you would to agree to floating storage, as would coverage from insurers. And you need to know exactly what's being asked of an owner. The position under a voyage charter is more complicated. Most charters will have defined load and disports and will require owners to proceed with utmost dispatch on the usual and customary route between such port. This will also be the owner's obligation under any bills of lading issued. And this doesn't leave a great deal of room for floating storage. Whilst there are certain voyage charter forms that do permit charterers to stop the vessel and issue revised orders, if the vessel is laden, then time spent awaiting orders shall count as lay time or demurrage. And whilst this might be acceptable for an owner for a short period of time if the demurrage rate is healthy, if it continues for an extended period, there is the possibility of frustration. Putting aside even if there is a contractual right for floating storage and all the parties agree to it on an ad hoc basis, there are commercial and technical issues which would need to be considered before and during the period of floating storage, which can include things like hull fouling, safety of the storage place if anchored or drifting. Does the vessel have sufficient supplies for on board for an extended idle period? Often vessels rely on being underway to generate fresh water. Do the various insurances respond to floating storage? And we also would need to be mindful of the risk of cargo deterioration and the potential for cargo claims. Does there need to be a shift in responsibility for those during a floating storage period? So to sum up floating storage, whilst it's historically been an issue limited to specific charter or at a push geographical areas during perhaps political unrest or war issues, it's quite possible that with the move away from fossil fuels, that supply and demand relationship might not be as smooth in the future. So we could well see more floating storage issues in the future, though perhaps not quite on the scale of April and May 2020. So certainly something to consider for future contracts. New slide, please. So this takes us to another big issue and a tragic and often hidden consequence of the COVID pandemic, and it's one that's very much continuing. The spread of COVID-19 has left many seafarers trapped on board their vessels, unable to return home. While they are entitled to repatriation under the Maritime Labour Convention, it has been seen that in reality, these rights have limited utility in circumstances where international travel remains severely restricted. And unfortunately, this challenge is set to continue well into 2021 and possibly even beyond, with emerging COVID variants and different levels of vaccinations, making travel disruption something we're all going to have to live with for some time. So what are the ins and outs of crew changes? Well, charterers understandably view crew changes as an inconvenience, and it's been reported that some charterers have insisted on no crew change clauses in charter parties, a move that's been heavily criticised by the IMO. The upshot is that vessels are now sailing with crew with expired contracts, some exceeding the maximum 12-month period specified under the Maritime Labour Convention. And shockingly, a recent estimate of the number of seafarers stranded at sea puts this figure in the hundreds of thousands. So what is the position under the charter? Well, there's two main issues: the right to deviate for a crew change, and what happens if there needs to be a period of quarantine at the crew change location. Under most standard charter forms, the owners have a liberty to deviate for the purpose of saving life. A similar liberty is included in Article 4, Rule 4 of the Hague-Visby Rules, which may apply if incorporated into the charter. However, these provisions are unlikely to apply if the crew are healthy, and debate as to what healthy constitutes. Added to that, on time charters, charterers are obliged to pay hire unless the off-hire clause operates, and most industry standard off-hire clauses, with the exception of shell time, do not expressly mention quarantine delays. So as a charterer, you end up in a contract interpretation exercise to assess whether any off-hire provisions, such as deficiency of men, might actually apply in the absence. In an attempt to address these crew change issues, which were reaching endemic proportions over the summer of 2020, BIMCO released their COVID-19 crew change clause, which came in June. And when incorporated into a charter party, this gives the owners the liberty to deviate for crew changes, but only under quite tightly defined circumstances, which I would submit offers only limited scope for crew changes during a pandemic where access to ports can change in a matter of hours without prior warning. There have been further developments in this regard over the course of the year, and in December 2020, the IMO released a recommended protocol for crew changes. And we've seen some 800 organisations also sign up to the Neptune Declaration on Seafarer Wellbeing. And a uniform global approach to this issue would be very much welcomed. However, in circumstances where there's been a very national response to COVID, we are stuck with the status quo, which is an ever-changing set of local rules and regulations which need to be managed pragmatically within the confines of existing long-term contracts. So turning to the fourth and final issue that I'm going to cover that we've seen this year. If I could have a new slide, please, Mina. Is notice requirements. And by this, I mean contractual notice provisions, but it's worth saying that if you are working from home and your organization is working from home over the last 12 months and intends to do so in the future, you should have procedures in place for monitoring hard copy post and faxes for court and arbitrations, which might arrive in your office in your absence. But turning to a contractual notice, you need to understand what it is. Is there a named recipient? What method of communication might be permitted under that clause? And while we would recommend a move towards email communication, we would add a health warning with this. And people leave organizations or change roles with organizations quite regularly now. And to ensure that it makes sense to ensure there's a contractual obligation on the recipient to ensure that email addresses are current and relevant. And also think pragmatically and practically outside your contract terms when thinking about notice provisions. If an office is in a large office building, some buildings won't let couriers deliver notices to named recipients. And under your clause, would a signature for a letter at the front desk by a person completely unconnected to the recipient organisation be good notice under your existing clauses? All things to consider and many lessons learned over the last 12 months. So that's the past 12 months. So what about the future with all that's happened? Well, I think it's fair to say, and I think maybe my colleagues would agree on this call, that over the last 12 months, the legal profession has gone through perhaps a decade of change, perhaps in a very short period of time. We've seen the rise of effective remote working and the rise of online hearings as a matter of necessity, despite the fact that the technology has existed for some time. My view on this is that this could have positive implications for court and arbitration end users, so long as the technology and the processes underpinning these developments keep pace. And with that, I'm really pleased to see that the new LMA terms 2021, which come into force this Saturday, have made specific provision for and guidance about virtual and semi-virtual hearings, which follows changes brought in the ICC arbitration format in January 2021. In this respect, I think looking at the future of dispute resolution, I think organisations in the maritime sector need to ensure they have adequate document management procedures and contract management systems in place going forward with this increased move to soft copy records, as much of the sharp end of the maritime sector still relies on hard copies. So this interface needs to be managed carefully to ensure all relevant documents can be made available in due course. That said, and while I do welcome these developments, I believe there is a place for physical hearings and physical meetings, especially when considering significant factual or expert evidence. And I think the use of physical hearings will become more targeted in the future to deal with these issues, to provide maximum value for money for the end user, but also the comfort and reassurance of being able to cross-examine and present significant evidence in person. So that's my reflections on the last 12 months. If you'd like to know any more about these topics, then please do get in touch. But I shall now pass back to Baptiste.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was great. We will move straight on to Monica. I think you're still on mute, Monica.
Thank you very much, Baptiste. Oh, my mouse decided to just stick right now. So what should have been a 1 second unmute took me like a minute. But anyway, thank you very much for handing over. I think you can see my slides. Essentially what I was trying to do is buy time to share slides. So that's very good. Thank you very much, Alex, for bringing me straight on to what I wanted to talk about. I was not part of slide change 101. But had we been part of it, we would have also been welcoming you to our office, you know, just to show you a glimpse of all the seminars and how it was like to see people in the past. I haven't seen my office for a year, so I'm hoping that this year we will see our office. But yeah, the first change is, of course, that we've all been working from home for the past 1 year, more or less. Since we left in March, when we thought we were just going home for a week and we'd be back in a month. Oh, those are the innocent days. But yeah, so as Baptiste mentioned at the outset, I'm a senior lawyer at GARD, in a sense, in defense. Sorry, I'm a senior lawyer in defense in GARD UK. And in defense, we pretty much work like a small law firm. So everything that Alex has mentioned is stuff that we've also seen in our organization. We've seen a lot of clause reviews in the last 1 year. Lots of members coming to us and asking us about different ways of interpreting clauses because the world has changed, but the clauses are the same. So a lot of frustration, a lot of force majeure, a lot of impact of the pandemic, luckily or unluckily, depending on how you see it. There has been an epidemics clause for the last few years. Different breakouts have happened, so we have kind of prepared for it. So I think most of our owners and charters have seen an ability to deal with the situation. Maybe not the fairest way, but there is a way that they've all managed to deal with it because they have an epidemic clause which assigns rights, liabilities, and how time is shared. Delay was a big part of what we're asked a lot about. Every time a crew tested positive, every time you had to deviate to drop off crew, every time you had to wait outside for quarantine, who pays for that time? A lot of queries related to that. So we've just seen a lot more of these type of questions as a consequence of the world we find ourselves in. In terms of claims itself, I don't think the fact that we've sat at home or sat in the office has made much of a difference to the way we work. For lawyers, at least, it showed us that really the technology was there, we were just not following it. So I think in terms of change, the mindset has shifted, and we've all acknowledged that we can work from home, and we maybe in future will look at a different way of working, different way of reading, different way of teaching, hopefully. Let's see. So that was very much from a defense perspective. What I tried to do was give an overview of what GUARD as an organization saw as change in the last 1 year. So we have a crew team. So I spoke to people in our people claims team, as we call them. And one of the things they pointed out was there were a lot less claims, but a lot more inquiries. So that's something that they've seen a lot of. The main issue has been access to vessels. And of course, in terms of access to vessels, today you can access the vessel from Singapore, tomorrow you can't. Today you can access it from this port in China, tomorrow you can't. So just the sheer change in rules, the sheer ways in which rules have changed. There is no way you can give any advice to members on, yes, this boat is fine, you can disembark your crew or you can't. So this has been a major part of the people claims work over the last 1 year, that they have seen port to port, day to day, country to country, time to time, literally today to tomorrow. This Chinese port was fine, tomorrow it's not fine. Today it had a 4-day quarantine, tomorrow it's a 14-day quarantine. Today it was fine, tomorrow it's not fine at all. Those kind of situations. I'm sure we're all aware of this situation. The other aspect they spoke a lot about was stowaways landing became impossible. Stowaways are not, I wouldn't say that common, but if you ever do have a stowaway on board, impossible to get them off in any country. No one's willing to accept anyone ashore at any point. Sailors are not allowed to get off. Stowaways, really hard. Unless they're a minor or really unwell, I'm told that it's impossible to get them off. If you manage to get them off, the claims handler gets a big clap because it's been such an uphill battle. Crew sign on and off. Who hasn't heard of this? As I've mentioned to a lot of people in the past few months, I come from a seafaring family. I have been sailing with my dad for the first 5 years. We were sailing on board, and the fact that seafarers are not allowed on and off, or that it's a basic right of getting off your workplace or signing off work, not being allowed to go home, is just such a basic human right that I cannot believe that the world hasn't woken up to it, or that we're not doing more for it. It's been an issue everywhere around the world. If you haven't heard of it, please go on the GUARD website, please go onto the IMO website. You will find all the articles you need to deal with this issue. So crew sign on and off has been a big issue. I then spoke to our loss prevention team and asked them what they have been doing differently. Remote audits. They've been doing a lot of data-based risk assessment, a lot of training. So a lot of their work is literally training, working with members, loss prevention in itself. It's just working with members and trying to get them to train. That's all been happening on Zoom and Teams. Much as Alex pointed out, as we've gone online for even our legal hearings, we've gone online for our training. So hopefully we'll see a lot more of it, a lot less international travel. And there will be a premium, I think, on physical contact going forward. I've had people saying, you can have this material, no problem. Material plus physical interaction, there's a huge premium over there. So this is £5, that's £500. So that difference between, what you can access and what you access in person, I think is going to become more apparent going forward. Online crisis drills are a big part of what our loss prevention team provides to members. We've regularly been going to members' offices, running these drills with them. Getting it online has been an interesting challenge, they say. Finding the chain of command when you're not sitting physically in a room, finding how you can work a notice board, those big white screens, those crisis rooms, big monitors, communication diaries, all of this has been interesting to find a way to get them online, make them work. And when they work, I suspect getting them work regularly, even when we go back to what we think of as used to be normal life. I also then widened the scope and spoke to members, our charterers. Again, it's a very similar pattern that we see throughout SIRE reports. All of us have had so many queries dealing with SIRE reports, getting the SIRE inspectors up on time. Now, no SIRE reports in person. Companies are not willing to expose their people to any kind of risks. Tanker management, self-assessment, everyone used to turn up to the office, have these audits, completely gone online now. Crew exposure is a concern. And then there was an increase in video calls and emails. Now, this was interesting to me. And I wonder if we could just run a short poll and let me know if all of you have had similar increase in video calls and emails. Video calls, yes. Emails, I did not find that, at least as a defense lawyer in car, that they went up significantly. What we did see is work as usual. So if you could just take 10 seconds of your time and let me know, have your emails gone up? What have you seen? It would be amazing. And we could just compare notes. That would be good. I think I need to buy a new mouse.
I'm unable to. I'm unable
yeah, hosts
to.
and panelists cannot vote. Our vote does not.
Oh, I see.
You know, you're giving yourself too much importance.
Okay. I felt there was an increase. There you go.
Increase in video calls or in emails?
Video calls.
Yeah. I think this is what we spoke about. We now have to dress up. You know, what could have been like shabby hair and bad hair day has now become every day you have a video call. You have to look good. I can see today you're all really dressed up.
Yeah, we see the same. Lots of video calls. I was saying, yeah, we see the same. A lot of video calls, which would be just conference calls otherwise.
Yeah, which would have just been audio calls or a meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think 93% have agreed that their video calls and emails have gone up. Maybe I should have divided it because my video calls have gone up and my emails have not. But, you know, there has been a change in our access and the way we deal with people. Again, owners and brokers, when I reached out to them, one of the things they said was crew claims. They essentially had a lot of files at the outset, a lot of claims, but nothing really, most of them did not really materialize. Either they were under the deductible or in the end, it sorted itself out. And I wonder whether you'll have seen crew claims, Alex and Baptiste. Have you all seen a lot of crew claims coming your way or not?
No, I haven't. I haven't really dealt with any crew claims, although some colleagues have been dealing with crew claims. So it has been coming across some of the desks here.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think, as you say, it's interesting you say that a lot of files are open, because I think when the COVID pandemic first hit, I think there was a lot of uncertainty as to the impact, and there might have been a knee-jerk reaction. But actually, I think while crew claims probably are up a little bit, as far as I understand, it's not a sort of a wall of new issues.
Yeah, I think for lawyers, I think we've realized how unimportant we are. Nothing has changed. Our life remains the same, you know, except for the fact that we work from home and our dogs and cats jump into our video calls. Our life really hasn't changed much. So the major change that's happened in my life and most of us, I haven't seen my colleagues after working together for 12 years. It's not that bad, but I haven't seen my colleagues for a year. I mean, we have a great relationship. It's been very easy to just pick up the phone or have a video call when you need to, because you have that built-in relationship. As I said, the more things change, the more they remain the same. This is a very glamorous picture of what it looks like to work from home. Any of you who faced this romanticized atmosphere, please raise your hands. Not me, I'm keeping it well down. It's someone ringing the bell, it's your kids asking you for tea, kids changing your profile so you suddenly look like a cat in a hearing. Who hasn't seen that video? Kids running in, dogs running in, cats over the computer. That's what I've seen. In a way, it's humanized your colleagues. You're seeing them at their worst at home. So that's one of the things. This has been my life for the past 1 year, except, you know, you just log back in. It's 360 degrees, back to your computer, watching a video, maybe while you wait for the next email. So yeah, I think what I can say is some things have changed, some queries have changed, but hopefully we'll see yeah, life remains. We'll see how many of these are implemented when we go back to work after all of us are vaccinated. So back to you, Baptiste.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was excellent. Last but not least, Nikhil, giving us an insight into the transactional world over the past 12 months.
Sorry, I was in mute.
It's okay.
Most used sentence, I think, in this year as well as part of change.
That's right.
Right. Hopefully we've got there. Yes,
Perfect.
so thank you, Baptiste, Alex, and Monica. A lot of changes highlighted there, and I think a lot of them we all can resonate with. But I don't sadly have a very nice photo of the office, which Alex has already presented. But I'll take you towards the financial industry. Another risk looming in the back of all the others through the last 2 years is the end of Libor. I think we may have heard about it in different ways and times, but this does have a very big impact, particularly on the shipping and offshore market, where most of the financing is based out of Libor being the most widely used benchmark for the interest. And this will have a big impact on loan financing, sale and leaseback arrangements, which are to the extent Libor pegged as well, and related derivatives contracts. In this short time, I'll try and attempt to take you with focus on the industry affecting points through the alternatives, deadlines you have to meet, and the key differences between the alternatives and which you're used to is Libor, and what you really need to do as much as the climate of uncertainty are surrounding it. A little summary of, as you can see, the main currencies that Libor was published in, most of which is coming to an end. This has been confirmed from 2018 by the FCA, which is our regulator in the UK, and the same with the US regulators. And again, affirmed even in the sight of COVID and a lot of work required in last month in March, that indeed it will come to an end this year. As you will see, that some of the USD rates have been told to keep on going till 2023. And there is also talk of a transition period Libor to be published for use in the market. The risk involved here would continue to still be that this may not be an exact economic equivalent, because the issue is what Libor is based on is the panel banks giving you submissions, information on the rate of interbank lending. There may not be that much information coming through. There may not be enough underlying transactions. So it may not be the same economic equivalent for parties, and the advice still is this needs to be changed. I'll also highlight that mostly the regulators want that this should be used only for tough legacy contracts. These are the risks, these are the available rates. These are the risk-free alternatives. I think the focus will today largely be around the first, the USD rate that in shipping and offshore. There is the equivalent in GBP, which is SONIA Sterling Overnight Index, and Euro, the ESTER, which is also still in development, the Euro short-term rate. And all have different working groups, as you may have seen, which are dealt by different regulators and different handlers, as opposed to Libor, which used to be more centralized. Moving to the key differences here on Libor and the risk-free rates. Firstly, Libor was a forward-looking estimation based on panel bank submissions, and the alternatives backward-looking based on actual transactions. While this actually gives a more robust and stable feel to the risk-free alternatives, the issue there is one of cash management for borrowers. An example being a loan agreement which has various interest periods and terms forward-looking would be able to know what the interest calculation for those periods is in advance. Currently, we're moving towards an overnight rate, and this may have some challenges for borrowers in cash flow and cash management mechanisms. Is it me, or have my screen frozen? Maybe. Well, moving on.
It's fine.
And final one is credit risk. The original LIBOR takes into account credit risk and a liquidity premium because of the terms it's issued for. The risk-free alternatives are issued overnight, i.e. there will be a different trajectory between both the curve for LIBOR and the curve for the risk-free alternatives may not look the same when it goes down the line to being published. For existing debt, which is already LIBOR pegged, pricing gaps may occur on various, particularly for the lender's side as a concern. What obviously the solution is that a credit spread adjustment is incorporated. And as we'll go on to see, this is a solution which is being offered, that in the new documentation, such things should be taken into account. I will highlight at this point before moving on that this is a developing situation. All risk-free alternative rates that are being published, but there's a lot of movement and a lot of consultation with the market. Even though we have a deadline, this is still a moving situation over the years. But with the regulators, the working groups, with the participants, and the LMA and LSTA, which are the organizations recommending correct documentation to actually give guidance, and together with guidance to actually make amendments to everyone's positions. Right. Bringing still with all the uncertainty that we are in and the deadlines we're facing, what does it actually mean? What do parties need to do, particularly for their existing debt that is LIBOR pegged? Step one, they need to review their existing loans to see if they have any fallback language. There should be in most LMA documentation, but is it sufficient? Unless parties have been using wording which is post 2018, likelihood is it is not. What is more likely as well is that even if there is language, they would not have additional triggers. For example, the pre-cessation non-representativeness, as they call it, but the idea being if LIBOR, before it ends, stops being representative of the market, would that trigger a change? Well, the likelihood is no, that will not, because the documents do not serve that. So what do the parties have to do? What can they do? What is the solution? Well, there's three main options for them. First one is using the LMA replacement of screen rate clause. This is published with guidance by the LMA. And the idea behind this is that the parties agree to have good faith negotiations at a certain point, the point being the trigger for the change, i.e. the LIBOR stops being published, LIBOR stops being representative, or parties agree a particular date. At that point, parties will go and have negotiations on what replacement rate they will use and the mechanics around it. As much as this will require further amendments at a further point in time, it does have its own advantages of allowing the parties to have benefit of seeing the market practice develop and use that and use the time and the knowledge to have their commercial negotiations. The second option is a rate switch mechanism, more recently suggested and part of the most recent documentation published in March by the LMA. The idea behind that is all the mechanics of how the rate will switch on similar triggers, non-representativeness, ceasing of publishing of LIBOR and an agreed date by the parties, whichever they choose. At that trigger, there's an automatic switch to the chosen alternative reference rate. This mechanism, again, has its advantages that parties do not need more documentation down the line, but they don't get too much benefit of the development of market practice. This will be agreed, pre-agreed before at a certain date. And the final one is to sort of hardwire approach if parties are already comfortable. There are examples of some trailblazers already agreeing on the software rate. So if they're already comfortable with the lenders have onboarding systems of the new rates, and they have agreed commercial mechanics, they can simply hardwire to just remove Libor entirely in their new loans and in their existing loans and amend to follow SOFR or SONIA, whichever currency the loans are in. Which brings us to new lending. And as I mentioned before, the most recent documentation the LMA has published is the LMA multi-currency compounded rate and the single currency compounded rate facilities. These incorporate all issues discussed before, i.e. if you have a credit spread that is cut for pricing gaps, but is largely based on the rate switch mechanism. You can also amend this documentation to simply hardwire the alternative rate if you have already agreed it. So new lending should be more straightforward for parties to agree. However, the point still remains that this documentation only takes in the non-compounded standards. So say, for example, non-cumulative compounded SOFR rate, for example. So if parties want to use a different simple SOFR or a compounded SOFR, which is publishing of sort of term, you're trying to use it for different term publishing of term rates, they will need to use newer schedules, agree mechanisms, and this documentation is not simply a slot-in exercise. Other considerations parties will definitely need to take into account on top of just the loan mechanisms is hedging. If they have a hedging and swaps into the loans and leasing agreements they have, they will need to look back to the most recently published ISDA fallback supplement. Slightly cleaner solution than loan by loan basis amendments, but which again, you have to ensure, particularly as I mentioned in the slide, the protocol, which will relate to legacy loans. The supplement takes effect in any event, which will amend all definitions and related definitions with proper fallback language, i.e. there will be proper language to say when Libor ceases, what rates will be used. And this master agreement should now then start following this 25th of January when this came into effect. For existing loans, the protocol will need to be entered between the parties, and they will need to ensure that they align their mechanisms of calculations and other commercial terms of their loans with the hedging documentation. Reporting requirements, the International Accounting Board has actually published their consultation papers, and this has affected, for example, IFRS. So if that applies to, there'll be more reporting requirements that parties need to consider, borrower side in particular. And as many of the changes in the climate have been caught by my colleague Alex and also Monica, this is going to be challenging for parties. Loans have to be amended on one-by-one basis on different terms. This is already a long exercise. Where they're syndicated, there'll be thresholds of consent required and many parties who need to come in and consent to these. When we're talking about security, everyone is familiar with the mortgage security in many different jurisdictions. Many known jurisdictions, for example, Liberia and Marshall Islands, do require each time where such certain important terms of your loan are amended, you will need to file amendments to your mortgage in those particular jurisdictions. So again, a longer exercise with lots of parties involved, and work should begin now. And that's why I come back to highlight this again for everyone, that this is time for action. If you're not already in action, you need to first review the existing loans, your legacy loans you have, agree terms with your lenders, see where they've got to in terms of systems of calculation mechanisms, what alternative rates they have on offer for you, and you need to agree those commercial terms. And finally, consider the three options that I spoke about and which works best for your legacy loans, for your new lending. And if I hadn't already sounded very alarming, the red text should hopefully make that underline that for you. I think that's for me.
Very much, Nikhil. That was great. We will now move on to the question and answer session. And so if anybody has any questions, please do enter them into the little box at the bottom. You click the button at the bottom of your screen. We do have a question for you, Nikhil, from Vivek Srivastava, who describes himself as a gentleman of leisure. His question is, what are the pros and cons of the calculation methods for the various proposed risk-free rates?
I think that'll be more for a bit more technical than my knowledge goes, but I think the idea behind these is when you have different calculation mechanisms, and in particular when you're looking at compounded, using compounded sulfur, there is some or compounded SONIA, which is slightly further ahead. The UK regulators and consultations slightly ahead of the US at the moment, is you can actually try to obtain, for example, term rates for 3 month, 1 month issuing, and not overnightly, just overnightly rates.
Okay, and I mean, is it you have all these various different rates, and I guess then you also have certain rates have been progressed further by, you know, the Bank of England, maybe further down the line. So I guess that's also something to consider, to what extent each rate has been, I guess, developed and finalized.
Which is the process ongoing at the moment as well, because in consultation with parties who are onboarding these systems.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think that answers that question. I have a question for Alex. Alex, I'm interested to hear, in terms of force majeure clauses, how have you seen those clauses amended over the past 12 months to take into account the new risks faced by shipping? And have changes been required to most clauses?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, not only have we advised on a lot of historic clauses, we're actually looking at developing new and improved versions. And I think particularly in the maritime sector, a lot of text is antiquated by nature. We've got new or produce forms going back to the 40s. And so I think it's fair to say, and I certainly welcome some input from Monica, is that what the disruption we've seen from COVID-19 is completely unprecedented. And in fact, I've actually read some accounts that the disruption to the shipping industry is actually unmatched, I think, in some senses. So I think your trigger points need to be looked at for your force majeure clauses. And actually, while some charters will have pandemic, epidemic clauses in, even the BIMCO ones are not necessarily sufficient to deal with what we've seen. And I'd say not only have you got to look at the triggers for your force majeure provisions, but also look at the supporting framework around that. Things like change of law provisions. Often a very well drafted change of law provision can actually assist a party in trouble if they're facing significant changes to local laws or local regulations. So yes, the answer is we need to be thinking very carefully about inserting new force majeure clauses, and even considering pandemic, epidemic specific wording. But the challenge is always going to be is how do you link the severity of what is happening to a clause which is going to remain static. And what we can't predict today is the impact of the vaccination program, whether we're going to start seeing vaccine passports and things like that, and how the restrictions are going to change locally. And so having a static clause that's too inflexible is going to cause just as many issues as perhaps a very, very broadly drafted clause. But I'd welcome any thoughts that Monica has on that.
No, I was actually thinking that it's only been interpretation. I was going to actually, Alex, throw it back at you and ask you, you know, as far as I recall, it's only been advice so far. I've not really had to actually, if I recall over the last 1 year, there's nothing that I've actually seen which has gone all the way, where it's been tested or seen. And I was wondering whether you've seen anywhere where this pandemic has actually resulted in force majeure being triggered and, you know, consequences of the same.
Yeah, I mean, speaking anecdotally, I am aware of force majeure successfully being triggered. Often in those cases, I mean, we have to bear in mind, of course, we deal primarily in arbitration in the maritime sector. It's quite heavily weighted towards that. So I think in terms of what disputes are we going to see coming out of the COVID crisis, to what extent we actually see developing case law around the use of force majeure remains to be seen. But again, because force majeure is a creature of contract, any guidance which emerges from the senior courts, at least in the UK, is always going to be subjective because it's related to specific. So, and if we see guidance on industry standard epidemic clauses like BIMCO, then yes, that can be of some use for the future. But yes, anecdotally, I've seen force majeure used successfully on a number of occasions. And in fact, actually, it's often been triggered by a party, and it's resulted in a contract negotiation rather than the termination.
That's exactly what I was going to say, that a lot of it is, if you're members of commercial, which most people are kind of trying to be, no one wants to be caught in a litigation or stuff. I'm seeing a more commercial resolution, giving a bit, getting a bit, settling at some 50-50 or, losing this for a future contract. So
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think the biggest issue with COVID-19 is that the majority of commercial counterparties want to perform their obligations and want to be paid for goods or services. It's just there's just been an interruption in the performance of that. So the desire to work together is still there, and the desire to reach compromise is often quite strong.
Yeah.
Subject to where the market moves.
Exactly.
Yeah, but like, it's no one's fault really. So everyone is trying to work ahead rather than hinder. At least that's been my experience. So that while it's all very well to advise, I haven't actually seen anything going very far, litigation-wise or arbitration-wise.
That's right.
That's it.
Nicola, I have another question for you. I mean, it's down to why do they call it the risk-free rate? I mean, is it really risk-free? I mean, what are the potential issues? I may have lost Nico. I mean, I think he has touched on some of the issues during his presentation, but I was, if we get him back, he may be able to explain why they call it the risk-free rate.
Isn't he around the corner? Can't you just run around and bring him?
I could go, yes. But let's see if, I mean, are there any other questions from either the panel or the attendees?
I would like to discuss with Alex on the change in documentation. So, in technology in our claims processes. I did find that initially barristers struggled to attach documents to advisors, but they've got better over time, and LMA has become used to getting electronic documents. They don't all say, send us a hard copy. Even if it is 1,000 pages, they do say, yes, electronic is acceptable. A lot more last year. We've got a lot more book subscriptions. So Chitty on Contracts is online for us, for example, as one example. Have you seen a lot of change in the way we're accessing documents and books in your?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of subscription services and materials have been online for a long time. And I think I touched on this in the presentation. I actually practiced from Singapore for a number of years, with the majority of hearings taking place in London. Now, for sort of interlocutory and minor procedural matters, the cost to the end user of having a physical hearing for something which really should have been taking place virtually, I think, for a number of years, was quite dramatic. And that kind of takes away from the true value of the LMAA process, which is the industry knowledge and the commerciality behind it all. So I welcome this move to online documentation. I think it's there are a lot of benefits. They have its limitations, and I think the new LMAA Schedule 6 to the new rules actually takes quite a sensible approach to the preparation and attendance. But I think physical interaction has its place. I think the maritime industry is a people business. People like to see each other and build those relationships, and I think hopefully there will be a blend going forward. But as I say, I think from the lawyer's side and from the P&I side, what I see as a challenge going forward is taking the sharp end of the maritime industry, which is still very reliant on paper, and potentially this move towards a pure virtual dispute resolution and claims process, and just ensuring that end users of arbitration have got the robust procedures in place to ensure all documents are accounted for and provided for. The days of of us lawyers receiving documents in the post, I think perhaps towards an end. But I think that's a good thing, because I think documentation won't be lost or misplaced. And hopefully that will have a positive result on dispute resolution and the claims process generally.
Yeah, because there's some stages that could be online. I mean, as a default, they don't need to be physical at all. And then you choose what needs to be physical. That's a better application of resources. And even, considering we're looking towards a greener planet, less paper in everyone's, around everyone, rather than on everyone's table.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the speakers. I think we'll probably end there. We are, it's 5 to 2. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to the SPNL and Maria for organizing, and also my colleague Mina. I will pass over to Maria.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for this very interesting discussion. Thank you to our audience for their participation and questions. Our next scheduled event for the SPNL is on the 4th of May and is co-hosted with Vista UK to introduce you to women in ports. We look forward to seeing you all there, and thank you very much and have a good day.
Bye-bye.